Good evening, Americans, and welcome back to what is shaping up to be one of the most chaotic and consequential weeks in American politics we've seen in quite some time. I mean, we're talking about a perfect storm of crises hitting the nation's capital all at once. And let me tell you, the tension is absolutely palpable right now. We've got lawmakers on Capitol Hill scrambling, literally scrambling like they're in some kind of frantic race against the clock, trying to hammer out a deal to keep the government's lights on. And at the same time, across the Potomac at the White House, President Donald Trump is weighing what could be one of the most significant military decisions of his presidency, a potential strike on Iran that has allies and adversaries alike holding their breath. Let's start with what's happening right now, literally right this minute on the Hill, because folks, we are staring down the barrel of yet another government shutdown. The deadline is Friday at midnight, and I'm not kidding when I say we are cutting it dangerously close this time. Earlier today, the Senate blocked a massive spending bill in what can only be described as a dramatic vote that sent shockwaves through the Capitol. The final tally was 45 to 55, and here's the kicker. It wasn't just Democrats who voted no. 7 conservative Republicans joined every single Democrat in blocking the advancement of this critical 6-bill funding package. 7 Republicans, folks. That tells you something about how messy this situation has become. Now, you might be asking yourself, what the heck is going on here? Why can't they just pass the dang bill and keep the government running? Well, buckle up, because this is where things get really complicated and honestly pretty disturbing. The sticking point, the thing that's got Democrats digging in their heels and refusing to budge, is the Department of Homeland Security and specifically Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. See, there was a fatal shooting up in Minneapolis last week. A U.S. citizen, Alex Pretti, was killed by federal immigration agents. And this has sparked absolute outrage among Democrats who are now saying enough is enough. They're demanding major reforms to how ICE operates before they'll agree to fund the agency. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer laid it out pretty bluntly earlier this week. He said, and I'm quoting here, "I will vote no on any legislation that funds ICE until it is reined in and overhauled, and Senate Democrats are overwhelmingly united on this issue." That's a pretty definitive statement, folks. Schumer went on to call what's happening in Minneapolis madness and terror that must stop immediately. Those are strong words from the minority leader, and they signal just how serious Democrats are about forcing changes to ICE policy. So here's what's being negotiated right now, literally as we speak. The White House and Senate Democrats are trying to work out a deal where they would split off the Department of Homeland Security funding from the rest of the spending package. They'd give DHS a short-term funding extension, kind of like a temporary patch, to buy time for more negotiations about reforming ICE. But here's where it gets tricky. There's a huge disagreement about how long that temporary extension should last. The Trump administration wants 6 weeks. 6 weeks to figure this stuff out. But Democrats are saying absolutely not. 2 weeks is the absolute maximum they'll accept. Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut told reporters, "For me, 2 weeks would be the outer limit. It gives us enough time to impose these restraints and reforms." Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, he's been even more adamant. He said, "More people can get killed in 2 weeks," emphasizing the urgency of getting ICE reforms implemented immediately. That's a pretty sobering statement when you think about it. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Markwayne Mullin is pushing back, saying 2 weeks isn't enough time procedurally to renegotiate, consider, and pass a new DHS funding bill. He said they need to go through amendments, through cloture, through all the legislative processes, and 2 weeks just doesn't cut it. So you've got this standoff where Republicans are asking for 6 weeks, Democrats are saying 2 weeks max. And Senator Tom Tillis suggested maybe they could find some kind of middle ground at 3 or 5 weeks. Now, what exactly are Democrats demanding when it comes to ICE reforms? Well, they want federal agents to obtain warrants before making arrests. That seems pretty reasonable, right? They want clearer rules about how agents identify themselves when they're conducting operations. Democrats are also pushing for body cameras, making ICE more like other law enforcement agencies. And here's something interesting. Some Republicans are actually signaling they're open to at least considering some of these reforms. Senator Lindsey Graham, not exactly known as a progressive firebrand, told reporters that Democrats are wanting some reforms that make sense to me, body cameras making ICE more like other agencies. He said he's willing to entertain some reforms to make sure that we rein in ICE appropriately and make it more professional. Senator Todd Young from Indiana said he's perfectly happy to have a conversation about body cameras. Very good idea for anyone in law enforcement. So there's at least some willingness among Republicans to discuss reforms, which could be encouraging. But then you've got Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana saying every federal agency can be improved, but I'm not going to try to make reforms with a gun to my head. That kind of sums up the tension here. Republicans feel like they're being held hostage by Democrats' demands. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries really turned up the heat today, folks. He said any short-term funding measure for DHS cannot be endless and it cannot be long. He went on to say that taxpayer dollars should not be used to brutalize American citizens, to kill the American people, or to violently target law-abiding immigrant families. But here's where Jeffries really went for the jugular. He called for the firing of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. He said, Kristi Noem is a complete and total embarrassment. She's a disgrace. And on top of all that, she's presided over the cold-blooded killings of American citizens like Renee Nicole Good and Alex Pretti. Unacceptable. She should have never been confirmed. Then Jeffries added, she's got to go. We are dead serious. She needs to be put on ice permanently. He also called for the firing of White House aide Stephen Miller. Now, what happens if they can't reach a deal by Friday midnight? Well, it wouldn't be a complete government shutdown. Some agencies have already been funded through the end of the fiscal year in September. The Department of Justice, the FBI, the Department of Veterans Affairs, they've got money. But other critical agencies would be hit hard. We're talking about the Department of Defense, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Treasury Department, the federal court system. The Internal Revenue Service would be impacted, which means tax processing and refunds could be delayed, and nobody wants that. Medical research could be disrupted. Labor statistics could be delayed. Essential employees at these agencies would have to keep working but wouldn't get paid until funding is restored. And remember, this isn't theoretical. We just went through a 43-day government shutdown between October 1st and November 12th last year, the longest in American history. That one left about 1.4 million federal employees on unpaid leave or working without pay. Food aid was in limbo. Air travel was severely disrupted across the country. Nobody wants to go through that again. Speaker Mike Johnson wouldn't say today whether he would bring the House back early from their scheduled recess to vote on a funding package if the Senate passes something with changes. The House is supposed to return Monday, but the funding deadline is Friday night. So even if the Senate passes something tonight or tomorrow, it might not get through the House until after the shutdown deadline has already passed. That's the reality we're dealing with here, folks. Now let's shift gears to what's happening on the international front, because while all this drama is unfolding on Capitol Hill, President Trump is dealing with what could be an even more consequential crisis, the situation with Iran. And folks, this is getting really serious, really fast. According to multiple sources familiar with the matter, Trump is actively weighing a major new military strike on Iran. We're not talking about some limited surgical operation here. We're talking about potentially significant military action that could include airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites, strikes on Iranian leadership, strikes on security officials believed to be responsible for killing protesters during recent mass demonstrations in Iran. The backstory here is pretty important. There were preliminary discussions between Washington and Tehran earlier this month about potentially limiting Iran's nuclear program and ballistic missile production. There was even talk of an in-person meeting, but those discussions have completely fallen apart. They've made zero progress. According to sources, the U.S. and Iran were exchanging messages through Omani diplomats and between Trump's foreign envoy Steve Witkoff and Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi. There was a brief window where an in-person meeting seemed possible, but it never materialized. Now there have been no serious direct negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, as Trump has ramped up his threats of military action in recent days. On Wednesday, Trump posted on Truth Social, and this is the kind of ultimatum you don't see every day, demanding that Iran come to the table to negotiate a fair and equitable deal, no nuclear weapons. All caps on that nuclear weapons part, by the way. Trump warned that the next U.S. attack on Iran will be far worse than the one carried out last summer when the U.S. military attacked 3 of Iran's nuclear sites. Trump literally said his next attack would be far worse than the previous one. Let that sink in for a moment. Trump also said Wednesday that a massive armada is heading toward Iran. A massive armada, folks. The USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group entered the Indian Ocean on Monday and is continuing to move closer to Iranian waters, where it could support any potential operations against the country. This carrier strike group could help with strikes and also protect regional allies from potential Iranian retaliation. That's significant military muscle being positioned in the region, and it's not subtle. This is Trump sending a very clear message to Tehran. What exactly is the U.S. demanding from Iran? Well, the preconditions for even having a meeting are pretty steep. The U.S. wants a permanent end to uranium enrichment, which is central to Iran's nuclear program. They want new curbs on Iran's ballistic missile program. They want Iran to halt all support for its proxies in the region, groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq and Syria. But here's the biggest sticking point, according to sources. The U.S. is demanding that Iran agree to put limits on the range of its ballistic missiles. This is an acute concern for Israel, which had to expend much of its missile interceptor stockpile shooting down Iranian ballistic missiles during last June's 12-day war. Iran has completely balked at that demand and told the U.S. it would only discuss its nuclear program, nothing else. The U.S. hasn't replied, so both sides are basically at a dead end right now. Iran's response to Trump's threats has been defiant and pretty ominous. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi warned Wednesday that Iran's armed forces are fully prepared to respond immediately and powerfully to any aggression against Iran's territory, airspace, or waters. He wrote on X, and I'm quoting here, "Our brave armed forces are prepared, with their fingers on the trigger, to immediately and powerfully respond to any aggression against our beloved land, air, and sea." Fingers on the trigger, folks. That's the phrase he used. Ali Shamkhani, a key advisor to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, went even further. He warned that any military action would be considered the start of war and vowed an unprecedented response, specifically naming Tel Aviv as a target. So Iran is basically saying if the U.S. strikes them, they're going to hit Israel. That's the kind of escalation spiral that keeps military strategists up at night. Here's what makes this situation even more complicated. U.S. intelligence reports, which Trump has been briefed on, indicate that the Iranian regime is actually in a historically weak position right now. They've been hit by U.S. and Israeli strikes on their nuclear sites and proxy forces. They dealt with mass protests earlier this month. Trump even hinted last weekend that he wants to see Khamenei removed from power. He told Politico, "It's time to look for new leadership in Iran." Secretary of State Marco Rubio echoed that sentiment, telling lawmakers Wednesday that the Iranian regime is probably weaker than it has ever been. But here's the thing, and this is important. Intelligence officials are cautioning that even if you remove Khamenei, it doesn't necessarily mean the regime falls. One source familiar with the intelligence told CNN, even if you remove the Ayatollah, his successors are all hardliners too. There are no indications that Iran's security services are preparing to turn against the government. Rubio himself acknowledged this uncertainty, saying, "No one knows who would take over if the supreme leader is removed from power. So the idea that you can just decapitate the Iranian leadership and everything changes for the better, that's not necessarily supported by the intelligence." Trump apparently wants to carry out what one official called a powerful, conclusive strike that will force Tehran to accept U.S. terms. If an attack is ordered, Trump wants to declare victory quickly. On Truth Social Wednesday, Trump seemed to compare a possible military operation against Iran to the one he ordered in Venezuela back in December to remove then-President Nicolas Maduro. But two U.S. officials told CNN that Trump is aware a military strike against Iran would be vastly more difficult than that covert operation into Venezuela. Iran has an array of air defense systems, ballistic missiles, one-way attack drones, and aging but battle-tested U.S. and Russian fighter jets. Tehran's military capabilities, even if far outnumbered and much older than modern U.S. systems, make a decisive strike far more difficult. And unlike Caracas, which is close to the coast, Tehran is hours from the coast, posing different operational challenges. Also, the Trump administration had conversations with the now interim Venezuelan government before detaining Maduro, laying groundwork for a transitional regime. Those kinds of conversations haven't happened on the Iranian side. Rubio acknowledged Wednesday that the situation in Iran is more complex, saying, "You're talking about a regime that's in place for a very long time, so that's going to require careful thinking if that eventuality ever presents itself." Here's another wrinkle that's making this whole thing even more complicated. Key U.S. allies Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have ruled out use of their airspace and territory for a U.S. operation against Iran. They announced this earlier this week, and it's a pretty significant rebuke. Without access to Saudi and Emirati airspace, any U.S. military operation becomes logistically much more challenging. Trita Parsi from the Quincy Institute noted that Iran's message to these countries has likely been that any country that allowed this airspace to be used will also be seen as a legitimate target from the Iranian side. So Iran is threatening U.S. allies if they cooperate with American military action, and those allies are taking those threats seriously enough to publicly declare they won't help. There's even talk about targeting Khamenei himself, but that poses its own challenges. After last June's conflict between Israel and Iran, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz acknowledged the country didn't have the opportunity to strike the Ayatollah. He said he was a legitimate target for elimination, but it wasn't possible this time around. Katz explained that Khamenei understood he was targeted and went deep underground, breaking off contact even with his commanders. Katz told Cannes News, so ultimately it wasn't realistic. If Israel, with all its intelligence capabilities, couldn't locate and target Khamenei, it's not clear the U.S. would have better luck. So that's the Iranian situation in a nutshell. Trump threatening major military action, Iran vowing immediate retaliation targeting Israel, U.S. allies refusing to cooperate, intelligence suggesting the regime is weak but not on the verge of collapse, and negotiations completely stalled. It's an extraordinarily dangerous situation, and how it plays out over the coming days and weeks could reshape the entire Middle East. Now, back to what happened today at the White House, because there was a cabinet meeting that was pretty noteworthy for what wasn't discussed as much as what was. President Trump held about a 90-minute meeting with his cabinet where they talked about government shutdown negotiations, Venezuela, the economy, and Ukraine. But here's what's really interesting. There was notably no in-depth discussion of the immigration agenda or the tense situation in Minneapolis, despite that being arguably the most pressing domestic crisis right now. And get this, neither Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem nor Attorney General Pam Bondi spoke during the meeting. Given that Democrats are calling for Noem's head and the entire government funding crisis centers on ICE operations that fall under her department, that silence was pretty deafening. Even more unusual, Trump didn't take any questions from reporters after the meeting. That's actually pretty rare for Trump, who's usually pretty loquacious and likes engaging with the press. After about 90 minutes of talking, Trump just said, "Thank you very much, everybody," and wrapped it up. Reporters shouted questions at him, but he shook his head, indicating he wasn't interested in answering. CNN's Caitlin Collins was in the room and asked why he wasn't taking questions, but Trump just walked out. That tells you something about how sensitive these issues are right now, and maybe how the White House wants to control the narrative. Trump did have some interesting things to say during the cabinet meeting, though. On the government shutdown, he said he was optimistic Congress would avert it, saying negotiators were working on that right now, and I think we're getting close. The Democrats, I don't believe, want to see it either. On Ukraine, Trump said he personally contacted Russian President Vladimir Putin and requested he not fire on major cities in Ukraine, including Kyiv, citing the frigid temperatures in the region. Trump said, "I personally asked President Putin not to fire into Kyiv and the various towns for a week, and he agreed to do that, and I have to tell you, it was very nice. A lot of people said, don't waste the call, you're not going to get that." And he did it, and we're very happy that they did it. Trump didn't specify exactly when he spoke to Putin, but this comes after a deadly Russian drone strike on a civilian train in the Kharkiv region killed at least 5 people Tuesday. On Venezuela, Trump said he spoke to acting President Delcy Rodriguez and informed her the U.S. would be opening up commercial airspace above Venezuela, even though it's not technically considered closed. Trump said, "American citizens will be very shortly able to go to Venezuela and they'll be safe there." He also said major oil companies will be going to Venezuela to pick locations, though he didn't provide details. Analysts have said it would actually take years for oil companies to fully re-enter Venezuela, so that's probably optimistic timeline-wise. There was also a moment of levity during the cabinet meeting. Trump acknowledged that his last cabinet meeting got pretty boring, and he addressed reports about him closing his eyes during a previous meeting. Trump insisted he wasn't sleeping, saying, "I didn't sleep. I just closed them because I wanted to get the hell out of here." He joked about photos catching him mid-blink and said, "I don't sleep much, but you know, it's funny. Some of them got me in a blink." So Trump, with his typical style, trying to laugh off questions about his energy and attention during these long meetings. Senate Majority Leader John Thune said after today's failed vote that he expects a strong bipartisan vote once a funding deal is reached. He explained that some GOP senators were unhappy that Democrats walked away from the spending deal they'd already negotiated. 7 conservatives voted against advancing the package today, along with all Democrats. But Thune said talks are continuing with the White House, and he expects they'll reach something that can pass. He wouldn't say if the White House supports splitting the bill between DHS funding and the remaining bills, saying he'd leave that to the White House to answer. He also said he expects the House will do what's necessary to pass the bill and prevent a shutdown, though that confidence might be a bit premature given how divided the House has been. Senator Chris Coons said there's unanimity in the Democratic caucus that 2 weeks is the longest they're willing to go on a temporary DHS funding extension. 2 weeks is a long time, he said. Senators Tina Smith of Minnesota and Chris Murphy of Connecticut were pushing for even shorter, saying the extension should last days, not weeks. Murphy emphasized again, more people can get killed in 2 weeks. That's the urgency Democrats are feeling. Coons also indicated that the bigger fight is yet to come, getting the White House and Republicans to agree on what restrictions to add into the long-term DHS funding legislation. So even if they pass a short-term patch to avoid a shutdown this weekend, there's going to be another massive battle in 2 weeks or whenever that temporary funding runs out. This issue isn't going away anytime soon. There's also this situation developing in Fulton County, Georgia, that's worth mentioning. The FBI conducted a search and seizure of documents containing information related to the 2020 election. Fulton County Commission Chairman Rob Pitts and Elections Chair Sherry Allen strongly condemned the FBI action and didn't rule out legal action. Allen said no voting machines were taken, but other documents were looked at that they didn't believe had anything to do with 2020. Pitts said, "We will be fighting with every inch of our body, with every resource that we have. Everyone has told us that we will prevail in the final analysis. They don't know who the target of the investigation is or where the FBI is taking the documents, though an FBI spokesperson said the materials would go to the FBI Central Records Complex in Virginia. That's another legal and political flashpoint that could blow up into something bigger." So where does all this leave us tonight? Well, folks, we're watching multiple crises unfold simultaneously. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers are racing against a Friday midnight deadline to avoid a government shutdown, with the fate of DHS and ICE reforms hanging in the balance. Democrats are demanding significant policy changes before they'll fund immigration enforcement. Republicans are pushing back, saying they're being held hostage, and some Republicans are actually open to at least discussing reforms like body cameras for ICE agents. The sticking point right now is how long a temporary funding extension should last, 2 weeks versus 6 weeks, and whether they can reach a compromise on actual policy reforms. On the international front, we've got President Trump threatening major military action against Iran, with a carrier strike group moving into position, Trump warning of attacks far worse than previous strikes, and Iran vowing immediate retaliation targeting Tel Aviv if the U.S. attacks. Intelligence suggests Iran's regime is historically weak, but it's not clear what comes after if Khamenei is removed. U.S. allies in the region are refusing to let their airspace be used for strikes, making any operation more complicated. And negotiations between Washington and Tehran have completely stalled, with both sides at a dead end over ballistic missile restrictions. The next 24 to 48 hours are absolutely critical. Can lawmakers and the White House reach a deal to keep the government funded? Will Trump actually order strikes on Iran, or is this all maximum pressure diplomacy? How will Iran respond if the U.S. does attack? What happens to ICE and DHS if Democrats succeed in forcing reforms? These are the questions hanging over Washington tonight, and the answers could reshape American domestic and foreign policy for years to come. This is a moment of genuine consequence, folks. We're not talking about some minor policy dispute or political theater. We're talking about whether the federal government can function, whether American military personnel could be sent into combat in the Middle East, whether Iran and Israel end up in a regional war, whether fundamental changes come to how immigration enforcement operates in this country. The decisions made in the next few days will echo for a long time. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. We'll keep you updated as developments unfold. That's where we are tonight, folks. Multiple crises, no clear resolution in sight, and the clock is ticking.